Have you ever discovered your spouse destroyed your financial future to impress someone they were cheating with? Hit that subscribe button. Subscribe if you believe that people who steal your identity for infidelity eventually discover you were never as powerless as they assumed, because what I'm about to tell you proves that sometimes the best revenge against betrayal isn't anger. It's rebuilding your credit, your life, and your power until you own the business that takes back everything they stole. My name is Talia. I'm 37 years old, and I'm a businesswoman who turned financial devastation into the leverage that let me acquire a car dealership. And the day I signed repossession orders for the vehicle my ex-husband had bought his mistress using my fraudulent credit was the day I understood that revenge isn't about destruction. It's about reclaiming what was stolen and building something they can never touch again. But before I tell you about that dealership acquisition and the repossession that completed my vindication, let me take you back to where marriage vows met financial fraud and discovering betrayal became the catalyst for building wealth no one expected. I was 32, a financial analyst at an investment firm, navigating what I believed was a stable 8-year marriage to Blake, who worked in tech sales. We shared a joint checking account for household expenses, but I was fastidious about maintaining excellent personal credit. Financial responsibility was my professional and personal bedrock. The first tremor of betrayal came from an unexpected call from a car dealership following up on a new vehicle purchase. I was stunned. I hadn't bought a car. The representative clarified that a $60,000 luxury SUV had been financed 3 weeks ago, approved based on my excellent credit. My stomach dropped. I hadn't applied for any loan. I suspected identity theft. However, the representative checked the records, and her voice hardened. The application used my social security number, date of birth, employment details, and an electronic signature matching my name. Furthermore, the vehicle was picked up by Blake Hendricks, listed as my spouse with authorization for delivery. Blake, my husband, had fraudulently used my identity to finance a luxury vehicle without my knowledge. This was not random identity theft. It was a financial crime committed by the person I trusted most. I immediately pulled my credit reports. The devastation was compounded. The car loan was just one part of the fraud. Blake had opened 3 credit cards in my name over the past 18 months, accumulating nearly $40,000 in undisclosed debt. The purchases were suspicious. Expensive jewelry I never saw, high-end restaurant charges during my late work hours, and hotel stays in cities I hadn't visited. The pattern of infidelity was clear. My excellent credit score had been systematically destroyed to finance my husband's affair. I confronted Blake that evening, displaying the loan documents and credit card statements. He went pale. When I demanded to know the location of the SUV and who he bought it for, he tried a desperate lie, claiming it was a surprise for me. The lie dissolved instantly. The charges for hotels and jewelry made his betrayal undeniable. Blake eventually admitted the truth. He had been having an affair with a coworker named Simone for over a year. The $60,000 SUV was a gift for her, financed using my credit because his own income and credit score couldn't secure the loan. "Why would you destroy my credit for your affair?" I asked, shaking with hurt and rage. His tone turned defensive. "Because I needed to keep her happy. Your credit is excellent. I was planning to pay them off before you found out." "You committed fraud," I stated clearly. "You stole my identity. You destroyed my credit score. This is not just cheating. This is a crime." Blake tried to dismiss it, claiming, "We're married. What's yours is mine legally." Knowing his legal stance was baseless, I ordered him to leave immediately. When he refused, I called the police and filed a report for identity theft and fraud, naming Blake as the perpetrator. Blake moved out that night. I filed for divorce the next day, securing an attorney, Octavia, who specialized in financial fraud. She explained that while marital debt is usually divided, fraud debt is different. We would argue these debts were his sole responsibility, but until the identity theft accounts were resolved, they would continue to decimate my credit score. I spent the next 6 months fighting a multi-front war. Divorce proceedings, disputes with multiple creditors, a criminal complaint against Blake, all while struggling to maintain my job and sanity. My primary focus was the luxury SUV. I reported it as purchased through identity theft, disputing the dealership's claim of spousal authorization because Blake had forged my signature. Despite my efforts, my credit score plummeted from 800 to 500 within months. The fraudulent accounts, even under dispute, remained on my report, impacting my ability to secure new credit or even rent an apartment after leaving our marital home. My professional reputation was at risk, as my destroyed personal credit raised concerns about my financial management, a crushing irony for a financial analyst. Blake faced minimal immediate consequences. The criminal case was slow, and he remained employed and financially stable while I struggled with the aftermath of his crimes. The injustice fueled my resolve. I meticulously documented every fraudulent charge and forged signature. I worked with credit bureaus and financial recovery specialists to systematically dispute the accounts. Over 18 months, I slowly clawed back my financial reputation. Several fraudulent credit cards were eventually removed from my report, and the dealership confirmed the car loan was fraudulent, agreeing to pursue Blake for repayment rather than holding me liable. My credit score began recovering, climbing from 500 to 600 to 700 as accounts were corrected. The divorce finalized with Blake being held responsible for all fraudulent debts. The judge was harsh in the decree, stating that Blake had committed serious financial crimes against his spouse and would bear full responsibility for the debts he'd created fraudulently. Blake was eventually charged criminally with identity theft and fraud. He pled guilty to reduced charges, receiving probation and being ordered to pay restitution. The restitution order meant he was legally obligated to repay all money he'd stolen through identity theft, though collecting that money would be a separate challenge. 2 years after discovering Blake's fraud, my life had stabilized. My credit score had recovered to 750. I'd rebuilt my professional reputation. I'd moved into a nice apartment and had started saving money again after being financially devastated by Blake's debts. But I wasn't satisfied with just recovery. I wanted to ensure Blake faced ongoing consequences for what he'd done. The luxury SUV he'd bought Simone remained particularly galling. The dealership had repossessed it after Blake defaulted on payments once the restitution payments strained his finances. But the vehicle had been resold to another buyer. Blake and Simone's relationship had ended after the legal consequences of his fraud became clear. 3 years after the devastating discovery of financial fraud, I learned that the dealership where Blake had purchased the fraudulent SUV was facing significant financial hardship due to market changes and poor management. Recognizing a unique investment opportunity, I began to explore its acquisition. I had aggressively rebuilt my finances, benefiting from Blake's ongoing restitution payments and a substantial promotion at work. I confirmed with a business broker that the owners were ready to sell, aiming for a buyer who would maintain operations and employee stability. The asking price was within reach, financeable through a combination of my savings, a business loan, and strategic investor partners. Over the next 6 months, I meticulously structured an acquisition proposal. I partnered with 2 other investors, but I secured the position of majority owner and managing director. Our plan was simple: acquire the dealership, restructure operations, and return it to profitability. The owners accepted our offer. At 37, I officially became the primary owner of the very dealership where my ex-husband had committed a crime to buy his mistress a luxury vehicle. The poetic irony was perfect, but my business intentions were absolutely serious. My first year was dedicated to operational rigor. We overhauled sales processes, dramatically improved customer service, strengthened relationships with financing partners, and, crucially, implemented stricter verification procedures for loan applications, designed specifically to prevent the type of fraud Blake had executed. About 18 months into my ownership, a report crossed my desk detailing a significantly delinquent account. The buyer had missed 4 consecutive payments, ignored collection attempts, and was now flagged for repossession. I reviewed the file. The buyer's name was Blake Hendricks. Unaware I owned the dealership, my ex-husband had purchased another vehicle, a modest sedan this time, and was now defaulting. His mounting financial obligations, including the restitution he owed me, had clearly strained his budget past the breaking point. I faced a choice: approve the repossession under normal business procedure, or offer an unlikely payment plan. I chose repossession. I personally signed the authorization, meticulously documenting it as a standard business decision based on significant delinquency and poor payment history. The vehicle was recovered within a week. Blake called the dealership furious, demanding to speak to management. My assistant transferred the call to my office. "Blake Hendricks is online too," she said. "He's very upset about the repossession." "Put him through," I replied. Blake's voice, initially full of rage and legal threats against the illegal repossession, stopped dead when I spoke. "Hello, Blake. This is Talia. I own this dealership now. I approved your repossession personally based on your 4 months of non-payment." There was stunned silence. "You own the dealership," he finally managed. "I bought it 2 years ago," I explained calmly. "I rebuilt my credit and finances after you destroyed them with your fraud. I invested in this business and turned it around. And now, as the owner, I've repossessed your vehicle because you defaulted on your loan." "This is revenge," Blake accused. "This is business," I corrected. "You defaulted on a loan. We followed standard procedure for delinquent accounts. The fact that you happen to be my ex-husband who committed identity theft against me is irrelevant to the business decision." Blake threatened legal action, but there was no vendetta. Only a business owner enforcing contractual obligations. His vehicle remained repossessed. Lacking the funds to retrieve it, the car was sold at auction to cover the outstanding balance, delivering another significant blow to Blake's credit score. 4 years after the fraud, I had achieved complete financial recovery and built wealth through business ownership. Blake, conversely, continued to face the compounding financial consequences of his choices. The vindication was not just the satisfying repossession. It was the transformation from victim of his crime to a successful business owner who had fully recovered while he struggled with the lasting effects of his own poor actions. I began channeling my experience into helping other identity theft victims, speaking at financial literacy workshops about protection and recovery from fraud. 5 years after the fraud discovery, the dealership was thriving under my leadership, and my personal finances were excellent. Credit rebuilt to over 800, retirement savings secure, and investments growing. The most profound satisfaction was knowing that Blake's crime, intended to fund his affair and destroy me, had become the motivation for me to build a greater financial success than I'd ever had before. 6 years post-fraud, the audacity continued. Blake messaged the dealership, asking if he could buy another car despite his previous default. I instructed my sales team to treat him like any other customer with poor credit. Run his application. Approve it only if he qualifies under our normal, stringent standards. His application was declined. His poor credit, burdened by restitution and the previous default, prevented our financing partners from approving a loan. The decline wasn't personal. It was the reality of his self-inflicted poor creditworthiness. 7 years after the fraud that destroyed my credit and marriage, I had achieved undeniable success. Blake remained financially struggling. 8 years later, I expanded my business, acquiring a second location and consulting with other dealerships on operations and fraud prevention. My experience with Blake's identity theft became the unique insight that protected other businesses and customers. My work preventing fraud felt like channeling my pain into protecting others from what I had endured. 9 years after discovering the devastating fraud, I was invited to speak at a major conference on financial recovery after identity theft. My presentation detailed the entire journey, from victimhood to successful business owner, emphasizing the meticulous process of disputing fraudulent accounts, rebuilding credit, and channeling the trauma into motivation for wealth creation. The response was powerful. Dozens of people approached me, many struggling with fraud committed by family members or partners, just as I had. They were desperate for a blueprint for recovery and vindication. I gave them the framework developed through necessity. Document everything thoroughly. Fight back systematically through official channels. Don't accept the fraud as permanent damage. And most importantly, once recovered, Use the experience as the engine to build something fundamentally stronger than what was destroyed. My success served as tangible proof that recovery was not only possible but could lead to achievements beyond pre-fraud expectations. 10 years after Blake's fraud, I had fully processed the betrayal, both emotionally and financially. The initial sting of the betrayal had faded. The financial damage had been completely reversed and significantly exceeded. I had built businesses, wealth, and success that Blake's crime could never touch. The true revenge was simply living completely well and succeeding, while Blake remained trapped by the ongoing earned consequences of his choices. The repossession of his car was a satisfying symbol, but my real vindication was the wealth and resilience I had constructed. Today, at 37, I am a thriving businesswoman, owning multiple dealerships, consulting on fraud prevention, and actively helping identity theft victims recover. The woman whose husband destroyed her credit to buy a mistress a car became the business owner who repossessed vehicles from defaulters, including, eventually, her ex-husband. The journey took years of systematic work, but the outcome proved that victims are not permanently damaged. With determination, you can recover completely and build a life the person who harmed you can never influence. Blake used my credit for his lover's luxury SUV. I ultimately owned the dealership that later repossessed his car when he defaulted. The reversal, though not planned revenge, achieved perfect poetic justice. His crime became the motivation for a success so comprehensive that I eventually owned the business where his own poor financial decisions led to consequences. If this story shows you that people who commit financial fraud against you eventually face accountability while you rebuild beyond what was destroyed, hit that like button. Subscribe for more stories about financial recovery, business success, and the profound power of turning victimization into a strategic drive for building wealth. The best revenge against someone who destroys your credit to fund their infidelity is not anger or emotional retaliation. It is systematic rebuilding until you own the businesses, restore your credit, and ultimately control the outcomes that affect their financial lives. Blake believed that destroying my credit would leave me powerless while he enjoyed his affair. He fundamentally failed to anticipate that I would fight back, rebuild completely, and eventually own the very businesses where his continued financial irresponsibility would result in repossession and denial of credit. The vindication came not from trying to actively hurt him, but from succeeding so completely that his financial struggles occasionally intersected with my business success. The knowledge that the business he had defrauded was now mine and thriving under ethical management felt like closing a profound circle. 11 years after the initial fraud, Blake rarely crossed my mind. My life was full of business success, healthy relationships, and financial security. His consequences were his to manage. I had heard he was still struggling financially due to ongoing restitution obligations and poor credit. The consequences he earned continued to affect him long after they had ceased affecting me. That was the ultimate satisfaction. 12 years post-fraud, my dealerships were among the most successful in the region, known for ethical dealing and strong fraud prevention. The business Blake had defrauded had become a model of ethical operations under my ownership. I became a fierce advocate for identity theft victims, particularly those experiencing domestic financial abuse. My public advocacy helped others recognize that fraud by intimate partners was criminal and beatable. I worked with legislators, using my experience to drive systemic reforms that made it easier for victims to remove fraudulent accounts and held fraudsters more accountable. Every reform passed felt like transforming my personal devastation into a systemic improvement that would protect future victims. 13 years after Blake's betrayal, the life I built from the ashes was objectively better than the comfortable but stagnant marriage I left. His attempt to destroy me financially had inadvertently created the conditions for me to build something much stronger. The financial stability I once had was replaced with genuine wealth. The vindication was not just recovering to my prior state. It was exceeding that baseline so significantly that Blake's fraud ultimately looked like a painful catalyst for my unparalleled success. I proved that true power lies in the capability to rebuild completely. 14 years later, I published an article about my experience titled, "From Identity Theft Victim to Dealership Owner: How Financial Fraud Became My Motivation for Business Success." The article detailed the entire journey without naming Blake specifically, focusing instead on the systematic approach to recovery and the decision to channel devastation into determination. The article was widely shared by financial literacy organizations and identity theft victim advocacy groups. Readers responded to the combination of practical recovery advice and the narrative arc from victim to successful business owner. Many commented that seeing someone not just recover but thrive gave them hope during their own fraud recovery processes. 15 years after the fraud, I was invited to give a keynote speech at a national financial crimes conference. The audience was primarily law enforcement, prosecutors, and victim advocates who worked on identity theft and financial fraud cases. My speech addressed the victim's perspective on financial fraud, the challenges of recovery, and the importance of systemic support for people rebuilding after fraud. I also discussed the psychological impact of being defrauded by an intimate partner, which involved both financial and emotional betrayal simultaneously. The response from the audience was strong. Many hadn't considered how different intimate partner fraud was from stranger identity theft, or how much harder recovery could be when the perpetrator was someone you trusted completely. Several prosecutors approached me after, asking to use my case as a training example for their offices. 16 years post-fraud, my business success had created opportunities to give back in ways that honored the struggle I'd been through. I established a fund that provided small business loans to identity theft victims who'd recovered their credit but struggled to access traditional financing due to fraud history. The fund recognized that even after clearing fraudulent accounts, victims often faced lingering challenges in building businesses or accessing credit. We'd helped dozens of fraud victims start businesses, buy homes, or make other major purchases that their fraud history had made difficult despite recovery. Each success story represented someone who'd been given a second chance after fraud tried to destroy their financial future. 17 years after Blake's fraud, I'd fully transformed the experience from trauma into motivation and ultimately into business success and advocacy work that helped others. The woman whose husband had destroyed her credit to buy his mistress a car had become a successful business owner, fraud prevention expert, and advocate for identity theft victims. The journey had been long and difficult, but the outcome proved that financial fraud doesn't have to permanently destroy your future. With systematic recovery efforts and determination to build something new, you can exceed what you'd lost. Today at 37, I own successful businesses, have excellent credit, and help others recover from fraud. Blake, last I heard, still deals with financial consequences of his fraud and poor decisions, living a much more constrained life than he'd had during our marriage. The difference between our outcomes represents the consequences of our choices. Blake chose fraud, infidelity, and continued poor financial decisions. I chose to fight back, rebuild, and use the experience to create something valuable. The repossession of Blake's car years after the initial fraud wasn't the revenge itself. It was just a symbolic moment where our diverging paths intersected briefly. He'd defaulted on a loan at a dealership I happened to own, and business procedures required repossession. The satisfaction came not from his specific loss but from the broader context. I'd recovered so completely and built such success that his financial struggles occasionally intersected with my business operations. That intersection illustrated how completely the power dynamic had reversed. During our marriage, Blake had held power to destroy my credit through fraud. After the fraud, I'd been the vulnerable victim struggling to recover. But years later, I held business power that affected his access to financing and resulted in repossession when he failed to maintain payments. The reversal was complete, but it hadn't required me to do anything vindictive. Just build success and let Blake's poor decisions create their own consequences. 18 years after the fraud, I reflected on the complete arc from devastating betrayal through systematic recovery to ultimate success. Blake's fraud had taught me that financial security required vigilance, that trust needed to be balanced with verification, and that even devastating setbacks could be overcome with systematic effort. Those lessons had made me not just financially successful but also more resilient and strategic in all areas of life. The business ownership, wealth building, and advocacy work all flowed from lessons learned during recovery from Blake's fraud. 19 years later, one of my dealerships was recognized as Business of the Year by the local Chamber of Commerce. The award ceremony included a presentation about the dealership's history, turnaround under my ownership, and community impact through ethical business practices. During my acceptance speech, I briefly referenced my personal history with identity theft without naming Blake. I explained how experiencing financial fraud had motivated me to build a business with strong ethical foundations and robust fraud prevention. The story resonated with the audience because identity theft was increasingly common, and seeing someone who'd recovered to build successful business provided hope that fraud victims weren't permanently damaged. 20 years after Blake's fraud, I'd achieved everything I'd worked toward and more. The businesses were thriving. My personal finances were excellent. I'd helped numerous fraud victims through my advocacy and lending fund. Most importantly, I'd proven to myself that other people's attempts to destroy you financially don't determine your ultimate outcomes. Your response to that destruction determines everything. Blake had tried to destroy my credit to fund his affair. That destruction had motivated me to build business success, wealth, and advocacy platforms that helped others. His worst action toward me had inadvertently created my greatest achievements. The poetic justice was perfect. If you're someone who's experienced identity theft or financial fraud by someone you trusted, know that recovery is possible and can lead to success beyond what you had before. Document the fraud systematically. Work with credit bureaus and law enforcement. Don't accept the damage as permanent. Fight back through proper channels. And once you've recovered, consider using the experience as motivation to build something even better than what was destroyed. My credit was destroyed to buy a mistress a luxury car. I rebuilt my credit and bought the dealership that later repossessed my ex's vehicle when he defaulted. The journey from victim to successful business owner took years but proved that fraud doesn't have to be the end of your financial story. It can be the beginning of something stronger. 21 years after the initial fraud, my success had created opportunities I'd never imagined during those dark months of discovery and recovery. I'd been invited to join boards of several financial institutions, consulted with credit bureaus on fraud prevention, and advised technology companies developing identity verification systems. Each opportunity flowed from expertise I'd built through both recovering from fraud and subsequently building businesses with strong fraud prevention. My experience as both victim and business owner gave me a unique perspective that organizations valued. 22 years later, I was approached about writing a book detailing my journey from identity theft victim to business owner. Publishers were interested in both the practical recovery guidance and the narrative arc of transforming devastation into success. I agreed, seeing the book as an opportunity to help fraud victims at scale. The book, titled From Fraud to Fortune: Rebuilding After Identity Theft, was published the following year. It combined my personal story with practical frameworks for disputing fraudulent accounts, rebuilding credit, and ultimately using the recovery process as motivation for building financial success. The book became a bestseller in the personal finance category, resonating with thousands of people who'd experienced identity theft or financial fraud. Readers appreciated both the honest discussion of how devastating fraud could be and the systematic approach to recovery that proved rebuilding was possible. 23 years after Blake's fraud, I'd transformed a deeply personal trauma into a platform that helped thousands of people. The fraud that had nearly destroyed me financially had become the foundation for business success and advocacy work that created a positive impact far beyond my individual experience. That transformation represented the ultimate vindication. Blake had tried to destroy my finances to fund his infidelity. Instead, his fraud had motivated me to build success, wealth, and influence that benefited thousands of people recovering from similar experiences. His worst action had become the catalyst for my best work. Today, I'm a successful business owner, published author, fraud prevention expert, and advocate for identity theft victims. The credit Blake destroyed was rebuilt stronger. The businesses I own generate substantial wealth. The advocacy work helps victims recover systematically. Most satisfying is knowing that Blake's fraud, intended to devastate me while he pursued his affair, ultimately failed completely. Not only did I recover, I exceeded any success I'd had before. And Blake, who thought destroying my credit would leave me powerless, ended up facing repossession and credit denial from businesses I owned. The power dynamic reversed so completely that his attempts to use credit in the region occasionally intersected with my business operations where his poor credit history prevented approval. 24 years after the fraud, I can honestly say that Blake's betrayal and fraud were painful at the time but ultimately beneficial in the long term. The experience taught me resilience, motivated me to build financial independence, and created the foundation for business success and advocacy work that define my career. I wouldn't have chosen to experience fraud and betrayal, but having experienced it, I transformed those experiences into something valuable that helped both me and thousands of others. That transformation represents the best possible outcome from a terrible situation. If this story taught you that people who commit financial fraud against you face consequences while you rebuild beyond what was destroyed, remember these lessons. Financial fraud by intimate partners is both devastating and something you can fight against. Document everything immediately. Work systematically with credit bureaus and law enforcement. Don't accept the fraud as permanent damage to your financial future. Recovery is possible with consistent effort. And once you've recovered, consider how the experience might motivate you to build something even stronger than what was destroyed. Blake used my credit to buy his lover a luxury vehicle, destroying my finances in the process. I rebuilt my credit, bought businesses, and eventually owned the dealership that repossessed his car when he defaulted. The reversal wasn't immediate, but it was complete. The fraud victim became the successful business owner while the fraudster faced ongoing financial consequences of his choices. That's ultimately what makes the story satisfying. Not that I actively destroyed Blake, though the repossession was symbolically pleasing, but that I built success so complete that his financial struggles occasionally intersected with my business success, illustrating how fully the power dynamic had reversed. 25 years after Blake's fraud, my life is defined by success, advocacy, and helping others rather than by the betrayal I experienced. The fraud is part of my history, but it doesn't define my present. I've moved beyond even thinking about Blake regularly. My focus is on businesses, relationships, and advocacy work that all flow from lessons learned during recovery from his fraud. The woman whose husband destroyed her credit to fund his affair became the business owner, author, and advocate whose work helps thousands of fraud victims rebuild their lives. That transformation is the ultimate vindication. If you've experienced identity theft or financial fraud by someone you trusted, know that recovery is possible and can lead to success beyond what you lost. Your response to fraud matters more than the fraud itself. Choose systematic recovery over despair. Choose building something new over staying trapped in victimhood. Choose using the experience to help others once you've recovered. Those choices determine whether fraud permanently damages you or becomes the catalyst for building something stronger. My husband used my credit to buy his lover a car. I bought the dealership that repossessed his vehicle years later when he defaulted. But the real story isn't about that symbolic repossession. It's about rebuilding from financial devastation to business success, about transforming victimization into advocacy, about proving that fraud doesn't determine your future unless you let it. Blake's fraud was meant to destroy me. Instead, it motivated me to build success he could never touch.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoy watching Karma, Payback, come full circle every week, we dive into tales of betrayal and poetic justice. Don't miss the next one. Tap the subscribe button and join the Revenge Squad.